So this is my reading, reflection, commentary on chapter 29 of the Proverbs. As I mentioned on the last episode, there are 31 chapters in the Proverbs, and we are approaching the end. So I was doing a little bit of thinking last night after I finished recording, and I thought to myself that I sit down every night and I do this sort of thing. I speak into this microphone. I try to come to some understanding, some spiritual awareness, a spiritual awakening, such that I'm more aware and I can use what I've thought about in the evening to apply it to the day that is ahead of me. And I thought that this is almost like a prayer. In fact, in some sense it is. But there are certain ways in which it's fundamentally different. And I thought to myself, I may be doing myself a disservice that I try to justify to myself because I do this. I partake in the reflection and the study of the Bible, that I don't necessarily need to pray. And although many times I find myself within that domain of prayer when I'm reflecting and thinking about these things, I haven't made it an explicit part of this practice to pray. And in areas of my life outside of this, prayer is lacking. And so I thought, as a matter of practice, to introduce it at the beginning of a recording, even if it happens to be in the middle of a thought that I ended on a previous day, picking it up on the day after. I think that to begin anew, a solid prayer or reflection may be worthwhile. So that's what I'm going to start with here. Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I'm a bit hesitant to speak to you while I'm recording this. But in the spirit of all of the ears that may find this, I welcome them into this conversation and into this space, that they may share it with us. I wish to embark on this journey in chapter 29 of the Proverbs, for which my brethren, men who have lived thousands of years ago, have attempted to move themselves closer to you and to observe the patterns that they saw in their day and to write them down. And in that spirit, I approach this. I approach this with the desire to come to a more full, a richer experience, a more solid foundation. I wish that I can come to a place where I can understand how to forgive, how to use grace where appropriate, and how to orient myself in such a way that it is serving of your glory. And while I may end this prayer now, know that as I speak, I do it for you, for your name, and to become closer with you. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. So starting with verse 1 of chapter 29. He, that being often reproved, hardens his neck, shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. So the first thing that comes to mind here is the various verses that one encounters up until this point, for which there is, this is a paraphrasing, but there is an idea that the reproof, the admonition, the discipline, whether it be of a child or perhaps on the part of God to his children, this is seen as a necessary element for which the individual is kept in correct orientation, correct alignment, that they believe things that are fundamental to the stability, organization of society, stability, organization of themselves. There are plenty of places that we can go here when we think of righteous reproof. The nice thing about this verse is that it offers us a few twists and turns. So we're going to start with the first half of this. The second half is going to shift this, or the second two-thirds are going to shift this quite a bit. He, that being often reproved, hardens his neck. So let's talk about this word reprove. So a similar word that I think about when I think about reprove is to rebuke. And that is to express some sharp criticism of someone because of their behaviors, of their actions. It is a judgment. It's quite a fundamental judgment, or at least it can be. I think about a child that is scolded. I think about the times that I am reproved. I think about the times that I ought to be reproved. Perhaps I'm not honest with myself, and I don't do it. Thinking about the etymology of the word reprove, if we trace it back to its Latin origins, we have the word reprobare, which means to disprove, reject, or condemn. We have the prefix re, which is again or back, and probare, meaning to test, prove, or approve. So the word meaning to test again and to find unworthy or to reject after some examination. From the Old French, we have the word reprover, which carried the meaning to blame, censure, or express disapproval. So generally speaking, the French into the English is what we would recognize, though I much like this Latin description, that of a certain test, and that as we think about it, there must be some test for this rebuke, that the mind has some standard that is preset in it that would cause somebody to have a criticism of somebody's behavior, such that that behavior did not meet the standard. Of course, the standard in the mind of that person may be wrong or off, whatever the situation is, but that's beside the point. So we are faced now with a person that is often being reproved. So what can we say of this person? We could say that they potentially make a lot of mistakes. Perhaps there's something fundamentally, maybe not fundamentally, but there's something a bit off about the way in which this person participates with life, with the processing of information, the expression of information, the creation of new information, the way in which they pay attention, that causes them to fall short of this standard. We can also think about this as a highly competitive environment, maybe, in which there are high standards, in which many people fail to meet these high standards. And one of the necessary consequences of this highly performative environment is constant rebuke or constant reprovals. So I think we must keep in mind both of these situations. A person can be quite successful, quite mindful, quite attentive, and still be often reproved or rebuked. So we have to imagine a number of things as we move into the next word. He that being often reproved hardens his neck. So what exactly is being hardened here? Well, of course the neck is being hardened, but just thinking about the quality of the word, that of something being hardened. All the while I'm trying to think about the goodness, or the lack therein, of what we are seeing unfold. He that being often reproved hardens his neck. Now the effect of a reproof, when we say that it might harden something, I can think that, well, of future behaviors, it would cause a person to adapt in such a way that they are less likely to put themselves in a position where future reproval would be necessary. In the case of somebody that is a constant failure, this may not necessarily apply. I think about the trope that's in Full Metal Jacket in the beginning of the movie with Gomer Pyle. Somebody that continually makes mistakes. He's not serious, he's inattentive, perhaps there's some learning difficulties there. Eventually, because he is reproved so many times, he's hardened. There's a part of him that does very well once he is hardened to this new or this instruction that he previously failed at. But there's something in him that suddenly breaks, is suddenly destroyed, and it causes him to kill his drill instructor and himself. And so while I don't necessarily wish to bring Full Metal Jacket too deeply into this, I do think that that imagery is somewhat useful here. But moving past that, I wanted to break open this idea of the hardening of the neck. I'm curious in particular, as I know that there's, what we're ultimately referring to here is an aspect of mind, I think, that is somehow, again, being hardened, but how this relates in the broader picture of things, I'm not too certain at this moment. But when we think about the neck from an anatomical perspective, I think about the thing that carries my head. It is the thing that supports my head. There are plenty of functions of the neck. It is a vulnerable area. Many important blood vessels run through there. It is the place through which my speech can be articulated in a physical manner, expressed through the mouth. Going back to this idea of a structure that supports the head in a symbolic sense is the it is that thing that houses the mind being the thing that is our agentic center. It houses our awareness, our consciousness. It houses the self. We say that the neck is the spiritual apparatus in this context, if we were making equivalents, some spiritual structure that supports the self. Now, in a way, if we think about a hardening of a spiritual force that supports the self, that seems like it's quite positive. If we think about the hardening of a vulnerable area, this also seems quite positive. But perhaps there's something within the hardness that is actually fundamentally wrong for the neck, that it ultimately must lead to destruction. Because what we are talking about eventually is not necessarily the neck that is destroyed, it is he that is destroyed. And that without remedy. And so the question is why? Why would the hardening of the spiritual support lead to destruction? If we think about hardening a support, adding to the support, that is one potential interpretation. But there's no way in which somebody can make it through the Proverbs without realizing that there is a lot of dynamism in the spiritual domain, that the self cannot exist by itself, that everything requires a degree of interconnectedness in order for it to function. There must be this sort of reciprocal exchange of information in order for anything to continue. And I think by this hardening, I think about the restriction of that infrastructure, such that while the mind may be supported for a brief moment, such that it is able to adapt to the demands that are placed on it by that rebuke or reproof. But the repeated, the often reproof, without the grace, without the surrender, without the vulnerability that is given by true spiritual support, what ends up happening is a chokehold to the neck. It is It is the quality that produces the ischemia of the self, such that the self, the psychology therein, begins to unwind, unravel, become destructive. Destructive in the sense that the life that was once lived to make decisions, to be free, to follow the good order of things, is now so restricted by some immovable order. A unification that what? Denies everything else for the sake of itself? That it is only one way that something may happen? Not that truth itself is bound up in multiplicity, but truth, I think, is something that can be dynamic, surely contextual, as we've seen in the Proverbs. There are ways of understanding that are completely dependent on the context of a verse, about the relatedness of words. And a slight change can lead to the complete alteration. And the inability to see the subtle changes in things and how vast the potential consequence for these changes are. If one is hardened to these things, one will not grow, remain stagnant, and be destroyed, perhaps. And that without remedy. There's no coming back from that type of destruction. Now, there's another way in which this can be interpreted. That the hardening of the neck is not necessarily because of the adoption of some arbitrary standard that causes it to become calloused and cold, but more so what is being hardened is a person's receptivity to the rebuke. Because of the often reproof, the individual develops this shell, the shell that is unable to, or increasingly is unable to, listen to correction. And in this way, it's quite obvious. I think we took the difficult road first in that first interpretation. But in this way, it's quite obvious to see that if a person becomes hardened to correction, that they would never be able to make serious correction if they always denied fundamental ones. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked bears rule, the people mourn. So it is the evening after that previous recording. As I mentioned at the outset, I wanted to try with opening in prayer in each little segment. The segments are probably going to be roughly 30 minutes each. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I thank you that I can learn. I thank you that I can make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. I come to you with an understanding that I am not perfect, that I wish to be better, that I wish to be closer to that divine grace that both allows me to have space when it is warranted, but also to have the clarity of mind to reject those pursuits or the objects of attention that are contrary to any good pursuit. I pray that of the burdens that I accept, that my orientation to them is one of productivity, that I take on a burden or a load because it is good, and the suffering that attends it, I pray for the insights of grace, as I mentioned, so that I can continually be reminded that the burdens that I choose to bear and the sufferings that follow from it are a necessary state of that condition. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So again, reading the second verse here of chapter 29, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked bears rule, the people mourn. So where to go from here? A verse that's simple enough. We all, I think, understand this on some level. We have an opportunity here to speak about the righteous, to go into this with a particular detail. We have an opportunity to think about the position of authority, how that might relate to our lives. We could spend time thinking about how a righteous ruler or a person that is righteous in a position of authority, how this might trickle down to those that are in inferior positions in society. And of course we can go through the converse exercise about the wicked and mourning. But to begin speaking about the righteous, this word is always it reserves a bizarre place in my mind. It's a term that at once is somewhat understandable, at least on the surface, but upon further inspection I think it's quite difficult to understand. Righteousness, within the implication there, is that there is a correct orientation to the way of things, to the, maybe not just the way of things, but of the goodness of things. And it implies that there is an aspect of understanding and perhaps wisdom associated with that. But when we think about virtues, we think about the behaviors that are conducive to good behavior. It doesn't satisfy the question of, well, what is good behavior? What is morally good, morally just, morally right? Now, what I find interesting about our current age, or maybe more specifically about our current political environment, that although there are many moving pieces in any political movement, The political movement in the United States relatively recently has been a fascinating one to watch, to observe. We have an environment of two strongly opposed factions. On the surface, I think they are strongly opposed. I think many of us agree on many things. There is also this, not necessarily hemorrhaging, but awareness of this cystic mass that has developed within our government, for which many of us have not really paid attention. And after COVID-19 and the lockdowns, many people began to become aware of what is now commonly referred to as the blob, the government blob, the government bureaucracy, and the tentacles of which have spread themselves so deeply into our society that it has caused a degree of corruption, and I think wickedness as well. And what we see, although not perfect, in the modern political movement to counteract this is two things. What's fascinating is in the first situation, in the first Trump term presidency, we had this cultural movement of understanding that something needs to be done, something needs to be fixed. But also a culture of not exactly knowing what to do, maybe who to trust, or exactly what the problems are. And we went through a 4-year period of rather bizarre governance on the federal level, and then a return to another Trump presidency in which many things transpired, including an assassination attempt, including the decline of corporate media and the rise of independent journalism through social media, the changing of the tune of the social media companies away from censorship into a more open model, and that reinvigorated cultural desire to change something that we know at some level is morally corrupt. Now, all of this is easy to see at the political level, but I think that there are multiple layers to this. This sort of thing is playing out in our society, and I think in an intimate sense, on the face of every one of our hearts, at least for those of us who are paying attention. And what I think that this experience affords us is a way of approaching that word righteousness, a way of seeing it differently through our recent experience and through our awareness. We have come to understand things that are contrary to our existing software, maybe I could say, because the fundamentals of what we believe are influenced by many things and constantly being updated. But as I've mentioned, the aspect of increasing awareness and exposure and experience has caused both a return but also a desire to know that which is good and to move away from an experience that we all know is sort of palpably poor and morally corrupt, perhaps wicked. Now, not everybody agrees, of course, and there are many intricate arguments and details there, but just from a general cultural sway, I think that it could be said that this is true. So the question lingers, well, how exactly do we know what is good? What the right thing to do is? Outside of identifying the obvious things, that we want to be free, we want to be at peace, we want to have opportunity in life, not to be burdened by debts and by overbearing institutions. Even the matter of freedom, culturally, I think, is something that returns to us with a new face. But we have to ask ourselves, well, what are we free from? I think part of our contemporary cultural experience is recognizing that freedom and liberation is not a totalizing thing. That of our movements, of our operation, there must be these restraining elements. Restraining elements are the things that provide us with order. But of course the restraining elements are difficult to get right and to fine-tune, as well as the liberating ones, I'll have to say. Proverbs 10:16, the labor of the righteous tends to life, the fruit of the wicked is to sin. When I think about righteousness on an individual level, there are a few different things that we must consider. The heart is one of the first things that comes to mind. Transformation is another thing that comes to mind. Both of which are so complicated in their relationship to one another. I've spoken of this many times, trying to find myself distanced from the relativistic frame, being stuck in a mode of thought for which I can never really come to any conclusion, because I find myself lost in a relative sense of things. Now, this isn't always true, but it is a danger. Now, the heart and transformation are two things that I mentioned because the heart, being the seat of our feelings and our desires, can be both deceptive but also quite instructive. It is something that I think that intimately forms our intuition. It's both something that we are warned against but also advised to cherish and to make strong. I think about transformation because within that process there involves a fundamental shift between the way in which we are oriented, which would include the way in which we feel about things, what types of behaviors that we are prompted into, some by virtue of our feelings and some by virtue of what we believe to be right. But ultimately there is a bridge between the two. I think our feelings begin to flow into what we feel is right. But it is not always the case, I would imagine, even for the righteous person, that every righteous deed is associated with some euphoria. I think this would be silly. On the converse side, or maybe similarly, I think it's possible to say that not every act of wickedness is something that prompts an adverse feeling or an awareness in somebody who may not necessarily be wicked in and of themselves, but is unable to identify wickedness for its sake. And so there has to be a recognition of different domains when we think about righteousness. One of the domains, I think about faith alone, justification, that one's righteousness is declared based on their faithfulness to God. And that, again, doesn't really get us anywhere, because then we have to go into the territory of, well, what does that faith in God look like? At what point does it eventually, do we find ourselves in this reciprocal relationship of improving ourselves spiritually and morally? However, I think to avoid this pessimistic view of things and that relativistic frame, I think it is reasonable to assume that if somebody has a faith in God, a faith in that which is good, and by our general cultural inheritance for the understanding of that which is good, of valuing family, of valuing children, of valuing posterity, even if they are not valued in the moment, these things are within our grasp, within our awareness. Within the many pains of our sacrifices, many of us wish to endure those pains for the sake of what we believe to be some broader good, because it perpetuates our species, perhaps, on some level. But it also affords us an environment to grow up with plenty. It affords us possibility of doing things that are meaningful, that we fill our days with something that brings us closer to the truth in things, whether that be material, scientific, or spiritual and meaningful. The other side of this, or another potential domain, is living by obeying commandments. Commandments, perhaps, as I've mentioned, are passed down over a number of years, centuries, millennia. I think of the 10 Commandments. And by this process of sanctification, one can come to a degree of righteousness just by obeying laws and principles that are tested by time. Now, thinking about righteousness as of a person, or just as a concept that is concerned about the moral correctness of things, that of rightness and wrongness, think about a definition that we can use. Within the material domain, when we think about scientific pursuits, what we would want is our understanding of the world, of the material world, and of its causes to be consistent, so that we can reliably interact with and participate with those causes, those events. Mostly so that we can understand it and use it for our purposes. Also to avoid things that are potentially dangerous, that can bring us ruin. There's a justification element there. Now, in the spiritual domain, I think it's quite the same. Now, being being beings that are of a spiritual disposition, character, I think the more that we are aware of how behaviors or how our alignment to ourselves and to others produces the infrastructure necessary to be satisfied, not necessarily in terms of the heart, but to be satisfied in the sense that we understand which behaviors produce which outcomes. And more importantly, perhaps, of the graduated nature of these behaviors and how they can layer on top of one another. And what we find, what we wish to aspire to, what we wish to call goodness or what is right, is that which simultaneously provides us with abundance, but also a deep satisfaction of the heart. Deep meaning that we have strong roots, we have strong connections. These roots are things that keep us grounded, that inspire us to be productive participants of a collective, inspire us to be optimistic about our future, forward-leaning, that there is this inner spark of drive and again, desire to achieve and to make things better, however we might see it. Now, in our system, a person in a position of authority that is righteous, their action, of course, is limited. What it affords us, or what it ought to afford us, is the stability of institutions, that we can trust our legal apparatus, we can trust our governmental institutions to perform the services that they are intended to perform based on constitutional ideas, that corruption and waste is not something that we ought to spend our days concerned with, because it is provided for, or provided against. In other types of political societies, institutions, this relationship can be it could be different, more heavily ingrained, having more influence, more power. When I think about the converse side of this, but when the wicked bears rule, the people mourn. The wicked, while they may be on the road to evil, are fundamentally, I think, concerned about themselves. Insular. They're highly restrictive. But from the countless number of times that I have explored this term, wicked, I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a relationship to the word Wicca, which means wizard, or witch, I suppose. So there's this interesting connection to witchcraft, at least etymologically speaking. And following those roots for witchcraft, not necessarily etymological roots, but the meaning, I suppose meaning is wound up in etymology, but what I mean to say is that when we think about witchcraft, in the contemporary landscape, witchcraft is seen as something that is fantastical. It is seen that is a product of fiction. It is seen as something that we really don't interact with day to day. And I think that this conception, especially if we are to look at the etymology of the word wicked, and think about it from the modern point of view and context, we would miss something quite significant. And I think what we would miss is the possibility of a person occupying this station of a witch or of a wizard. In the old context, with all of, I think an important distinction here is, with all of the ignorance of the human experience and of the human mind, both of contemporary but also of ancient, it is, I think we would be hard-pressed to find a major class or group of individuals that, when focused so strongly on something, whatever it is, it could be literally anything, that there is complete absence of truth. Now, many cults have existed, again, both contemporary and ancient, but what we find here is not necessarily complete absence of truth. We do find an abundance of misappropriation of attention, so much so that the mind is unable to really determine what is true in the pursuit of it. And here, I find my mind getting a bit, not necessarily confused, but muddled. And it's a great irony, I think, that this is exactly what witchcraft is, at least to my estimation. It is that process of mind by which spells can be cast to disrupt that flow of attention, to point it towards things that the wicked person would wish them to point it towards, for their own ends, for their own devices. But when the wicked bear rule, the people mourn. Now here I have to wonder about the nature of this mourning. I have to wonder at it because I wonder despite the period, a despot is a despot, an arbitrary authority is an arbitrary authority. I wonder at the mourning because the mind must be in such a state of flux to be subject to such a confusing, centralizing figure or group of figures. Again, if they are ruled by the wicked, it is probably the case that these multitude, these peoples, will have in some way their mind disturbed by that wickedness, corrupted by it, blinded by it. Surely there will be minds that are liberated, that there's enough in the world for which the mind can think independently, despite the most ardent propaganda and oppression. But much like in the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, I remember vaguely, it's been a number of years since I've read it, but I remember vaguely this description about man as he finds himself in that absolute state of depression. I don't mean depression like psychological depression in the way that we consider it now in the United States. It is a psychological depression of sorts, but a depression in all facets, a depressed state of consciousness, by which I think about, again, the concentration camps and the people that were continually burdened by hunger, that their attention could not be afforded anywhere but of the most immediate because of their desperate situation. And in a like manner, as we can think about such a situation, we could think about it more insidiously, or maybe it's less insidious, depending on how one wishes to see it, but in a situation like Ukraine, where there is such an interwoven propaganda network, partly on the part of USAID, and partly on the part of the propped-up Ukrainian government, and as it is now under the rule of Zelensky. Even despite the war, the people that live under those institutions that are subject to these principalities battling each other in that sphere, unfortunately ending upon their very existence, terminating upon their very existence, fighting on the ground upon which they live and eat, laugh and love and everything. Here, the machine that finds itself interwoven in all of the institutions, the effect on the mind must be profound. To produce a state of mourning from here is not a stretch of an imagination. Of course, there are many, as I've mentioned, that understand how bad their situation is, especially in light of a strong historical knowledge of things. But surely there are others that are wound up so tightly in that propaganda machine that the wicked have them around their finger. They can direct them at first glance or at first gesture. And it's sad. It is a sad thing to imagine a mind that is controlled, that is unable to live up to its potential. Whoso loves wisdom rejoices his father, but he that keeps company with harlots spends his substance. So beginning with the first half here. Whoso loves wisdom rejoices his father. Why? The definition of rejoice: feel or show great joy or delight. So this wisdom, I think, is the axial point here. Much depends on how we see wisdom. And to love, that's no simple matter either. But love and wisdom, I think, are quite firmly connected, related. Wisdom, much like righteousness, I find it to be a topic that I come back to over and over and over again. I do my best to define it, and then when I'm exposed to it again, I find it such a magical word, something immediately difficult to define, almost as if the prior experience of defining it never happened. Or perhaps I understand that it happened. I understand in the background to a degree what I feel about the word, but it is such a large concept for everything that it implies, right down to the most practical, functional aspects, behavioral aspects of wisdom, that it is difficult to provide a definition on short notice. But of wisdom, I think it can be said that it involves knowledge. It involves knowing. It involves observation. It involves experience. It involves context. It involves perception. Knowing something doesn't necessarily mean that one is wise. I can know that there is a penny in front of me by looking at it. And there are many different levels of knowing. Ways of knowing, I suppose, but level is what I meant. For knowing that a penny is in front of me, and knowing the anatomy of the knee joint in particular detail is another level of knowing. And ironically, one I can see, I can feel, and I can touch. The knee in the superficial sense I can see and feel and touch, but I can also know the anatomy on quite a deep detail, either by looking at a cadaver or studying some anatomy atlas. Both are forms of knowing. Both involve perhaps different levels of understanding, varying amounts of information. And that knowing, wound up within it, does involve some contextual relations. I can know of wisdom. I suppose I can know wisdom. But just because I know that doesn't mean that I am that. And I suppose this is our first distinction. We can't be knowing, but we can be wise. And so there's this ontological separation between them. We could say in an extended sense that a person can be of knowing, but that almost implies that they are wise, that they are learned. So to be and loving this state of being. Here I find it interesting because it's much more detailed than just knowing the coin is in front of me. In the simplest sense, if we are to sort of make this equivalence between knowledge having multiple levels and wisdom having multiple levels, if I had to say of wisdom, of a simple analogy, much like I said of knowing, of seeing by my perception, I can see that the coin is in front of me. By my wisdom, how do I relate to the coin? Perhaps I understand how to use it. I understand its purpose. I understand its value. I think within wisdom, knowing how to interact with things is part of it, I suppose, but in this way, that knowing how I relate to that thing, knowing its value, again, thinking about an ontological state, that of wisdom, that if I am to be wise, I can utilize the things that I know. And so, because I can see the coin, and because I can grasp it, I understand what it may be used for. My wisdom tells me what I should use it for, and what I should not use it for. So if I find myself in a state of longing or in a state of desire, or in a particular relationship with, such that I love something, I can fall into something easily. I can be with something easily. I can be with wisdom easily. And wisdom being a thing of being, of existence. That I am, or that I can be wise. Within this track, within this orientation of attention, through that filter, I find the value of the Father. I find the heart's desire to be concerned with the Father, to respect the position of the Father, and to desire a relationship, a good relationship with the Father. Whoso loves wisdom rejoices his father, but he that keeps company with harlots spends his substance. So what is the definition of the word harlot? Now, from the old French origins, the definition of the word harlot originally meant a vagabond, a rascal, or a lowly fellow. And it wasn't restricted to the role of a prostitute. It could be a male servant, a person of low status. By the 13th century in Middle English, the word harlot was initially used to describe a man of low birth, or somebody rogue. Over time, it became applied to women of low moral character. Eventually, it became synonymous with prostitute, or promiscuous women. By the 16th and 17th centuries, harlot was almost exclusively used for a sexually immoral woman. So regardless of how we choose to define this, I think the meaning remains constant. It's quite obvious that if one is going to spend time with prostitutes, they are going to be spending a large degree of money, and this monies will reduce their substance. But I don't really want to remain here. I want to expand this out a little bit. Just as in the first half of the verse, coming to understand this ontology, this relationship that allows us to appreciate, rejoice, to find delight in, to have the heart exclaim at our relationship to our Father, that sacred relationship. I want to know likewise the keeping of this company and the spending of substance. What more is it than just being reduced financially? Now, being reduced financially, I'm sure, has plenty of broad implications. I know it does. But there's a way in which we can examine substance, the substance of a man, that is more than just what he has in his pocket. There's a perspective in which we can examine man's substance as his physical existence, that of the material that makes up his body. There is a way in which we can speak of it, as I've mentioned, as it's mentioned in the verse, his substance financially. We could speak of his substance spiritually, what makes up him as a spiritual agent. His feelings, his desires, his understanding, his relationship to his Father, his relationship to wisdom, his experiences. All of this, I think, feeds into his substance to a degree. Now, what matters to me most is, I suppose, my experience. And when I say that, I say it because I read this proverb. I read the Proverbs. I think about myself. I think about the way that I should be. And I think about the Proverbs as a guide to direct that way of being. And so I place myself in these shoes, the shoes of the person who keeps company with the harlots and whose substance is spent by their company. And so my question is, well, in what way? And I think, this includes harlots, but it includes in the contemporary era much more than that. Man is decreased in so many ways in the modern day. Outside of harlots, we can think of pornography as another potential expression. And the ways in which man is reduced by such superficiality, exploitation of his basic drives, his fundamental instincts, much like that of the cheap and readily available sugar that probably tempts a similar apparatus in the mind. But to him as a being, altogether, his substance, whatever physical apparatus, we can think about reducing that or having that maybe a dopamine pathway enlarged and hijacked. This, to our experience, although useful to know, it is not a thing of wisdom quite yet, unless we know it experientially and we know how to prevent against it spiritually. So again, I come back to, how is it the case that spending the time with the harlots, spending the time with pornography, spending the time with copious amounts of sugar or unhealthy foods, or just generally too much, how are we reduced in this regard? So I come back to attention. Where the eyes go is where the mind goes. Where the mind goes is where we go. It is where we are spending time. And if we are going to spend time in the domain of base desires, we are not using that time productively. We are not gaining any sort of understanding. We are not moving closer to wisdom at all. If wisdom is to be that thing for which we understand the relatedness of things, we understand how to be such that we can bring about goodness and beauty. The time spent with the harlot does none of this, and brings us not one iota closer to it. So today is a new day. So I'll start this with a short prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I thank you that there were moments today that I was able to see and to express my thoughts towards good ends. I recognize that I am imperfect, but I am thankful that I can see and appreciate the goodness that there is in life. I appreciate the reflection early this morning about all of the ways in which I can find myself thinking negatively about something, and yet choosing, at least for today, to have it not bother me, to focus on the positive aspects of life, to think about the goodness, however inundated with the bad it may be. Or rather, I should say, however inundated the surrounding environment with the bad it may be, not goodness itself. And so as I look to tomorrow, and I look to some important events, I wish to direct my attention in a like manner, to take that spirit with me and to have that fill me with confidence, so that I may have a productive experience. And Lord, this I pray, in Jesus' name, amen. So I was listening to a bit of the last recording and thinking about if there's anything else that I wanted to add to this verse. What came to mind was just another reflection on the importance of that latter half of the verse. But he that keeps company with harlots spends his substance. Not necessarily that he who spends his time or days with harlots. This is not what is really important to me here. It could be plenty of things that we can substitute for harlot, but rather it is the spending of the substance of man, that foundational structure, is spiritual existence. I think the more that we come to understand our own spiritual inclination, our own spiritual life, including experiences and also the agentic side of that of spiritual selfhood, I think the greater we are able to see in this light, in this domain. And that when we participate in anything, our mind is now oriented in such a way that it is concerned about its behavior. That the judge is along for the ride, but it's not limited to just persistent self-criticism and judgment. What also is true, I think, is the awareness of the goodness of that substance, what can be. And that desire is now oriented to increasing that substance. Also, of course, understanding what increasing that substance rightly means. The king by judgment establishes the land, but he that receives gifts overthrows it. So what is meant by the first half of this verse? The king by judgment establishes the land. I think we can say that, to some degree, making a judgment about something is coming to a conclusion about something. It is making a decision. Moreover, when we think about judgment in the moral context, we are thinking about making a decision between that which is right and that which is wrong. And in the establishment of such a precedent, let's say, there must be a necessary enforcement of that judgment. So regardless of the rightness or wrongness of such a judgment, there is a moral order that is put in place. When I think about the word established, I think about something created. And in the spiritual sense, when we think about creation, I think about a dynamic process. But fundamentally, I think about that meaningful, I was about to say meaningful material, which we can see, I suppose. Meaningful information. We could say perhaps information to some degree is material. That the material is expressing itself in such a way that it is meaningful. So I'll say meaningful material has organized itself in such a way to create something, to establish something. To assert firmly something's experience, something's realness, perhaps. The king by judgment establishes the land. An interesting thing to say, to establish the land. For in some sense, the land is already established. It's not as though the king goes out and physically puts together material to build land, to build hills and valleys and all sorts of different geological features. All of this is there for man to decide what he wishes to do with them. And so this establishment is primarily spiritual, but of the spiritual matter that I spoke of. Because of course there's a relationship. What exists upon any material block of land I suppose in some sense difficult to identify or to explain when we talk about things in terms of societies, cultures, principalities. But these principalities, they exist. They exist within that shared understanding in the mind. And as it's more firmly established in institutions and in order. Another aspect of the first half of this verse that I find interesting is that there is no specification given as to whether or not this judgment is good or it is bad. I suppose it could be inferred to some degree, but I don't think that we should put too much into that. I think the ambiguity of whether or not the judgment is good or the judgment is bad is important. And it bears questions. Well, if a judgment is bad on the part of the king, does that mean that the establishment of the land is going to be bad? Does it mean that the order is going to be lackluster? It's not going to be solid, irresolute? I think that's probable, but it doesn't mean that in all cases, the king's establishment, or judgment rather, leads to a type of establishment that we would consider to be anarchic or savage. Again, it's a possibility. But there are plenty of judgments, while in some aspects may seem good in the sense that it maintains a solid order, a solid functioning of society. But ultimately, it is restrictive to growth. And I suppose all societies come to this to a certain degree. They progress in certain ways. They live under certain righteous affordances, but they are tyrannized in other ways. They are limited unnecessarily or arbitrarily. And it is this process of coming to understanding exactly how a person ought to be related to his society, what his place in it is, his position in that order. And of course the role of the king, if we are thinking about these types of societies. The direction for which the king chooses to orient that society or that collective. I'm thinking in multiple layers here of my experience as an American and what I understand about the society that I live in, about the changing dynamics currently, about the dynamics under which it was forged, under which it was established. Now, the pattern of the king, I think, is quite a simple pattern relative to a free society in which there are many different elements that contribute to this judgment, which then bleeds into the establishment, whatever that might look like. The other thing I want to say here about judgment is that regardless of if we consider a judgment to be morally right or morally incorrect, if we think about creation as just a process of coming to be something, and when we think about land, and we think about how it has been formed, so many different things that have come together to make it the way that it is. And yet, all the same, there are so many different environments. I'm talking about physical land here. There's so many different environments, different climates, different elevation and terrain, and all of this sort of abundance for which land can appear to us. And I think in a like manner, if not to a greater degree, the conscious agent in the experience of man can create so many different landscapes. And again, regardless of whether or not his righteousness has succeeded him or has failed him, a landscape will be produced nonetheless. But he that receives gifts overthrows it. There's a number of things that we have to weave into our analogy here. First and foremost, the understanding that the reception of a gift is the thing that causes this to be tilted in a contrary manner. I think it's interesting. And then the second, the word overthrowing. How exactly does that relate to this image of the landscape and the cognitive domain that has spread itself across the physical landscape? So just focusing on receiving a gift. When I think of receiving a gift in this context, my mind immediately goes to a bribe. That is of what is a bribe exactly? It is the propagation of one's interest through the channels of authority, through the channels of power, by purchasing, essentially, space in the mind of another, or space in the authority of the position of the person that holds it. If we think about a rather simple example, I was talking to somebody at work the other day, an old carpenter, and he said that when he started his career, he skipped the traditional process to become a journeyman. Now, of course, the true process of becoming a journeyman nobody can skip. But formally, he went down to the local office, and he was advised by somebody, I'm not sure who, he said if it was a coworker or if he had called some representative of the union, the carpenters' union. But they told him to go down to the office and to ask if he can purchase a journeyman's card. Now, a journeyman is it's a status. It is something that is achieved, it is earned. A journeyman is somebody that has gone through an education process, that has been educated by the older guys. And to say that one can just purchase the card that automatically allows somebody to work as a carpenter without any experience, I think is a form of bribery. Because now the person has taken up space in that agency, that is the union that is responsible for granting these cards. And by their own corruption, they have accepted the gift of somebody that wishes to gain something that they don't deserve, perhaps, in this case, so that another can benefit from it. And while in the end, in this particular case, it winded up being okay, he was able to find work and just go through a learning process. In that case, the journeyman's card probably doesn't really mean all that much, but things have changed now. That people go through a formal apprenticeship and then apply for that journeyman's card. And I think there are many examples of differing contexts and situations that we can use here. And there are plenty of ways in which I think a bribe can influence or have downstream consequences. And what is downstream in the case, or at the scale that we're talking about here, in terms of the kingdom, where one man is at the head of the civil apparatus. The water downstream to him is not somebody's home, it is not somebody's cabinets, it is the entire society. And for somebody to come and buy an equivalence of a journeyman's card from the king, and in this case the scale of which might be ownership of a particular stretch of land and everything that is on that land, including people. The authority and the responsibility that is given to the person that bribes the king is not formally vetted. Now, this is one potential interpretation, because the gift in this case is the bribe. But I also think that there are plenty of ways in which we can conceptualize a gift. So I'd like to explore this a little bit more. keeping in mind that initial interpretation, because it's probably going to be useful to a degree. When we think about the definition of the word gift, number one, a thing given willingly to someone without payment, a present. Two, a natural ability or talent. Now that second definition is something that I'm leaning away from. A natural ability or talent, receiving that from God, let's say, from one's parents. This could imply some sort of revolutionary type character that is born into this restrictive environment. That's one potential interpretation, but I don't think that that's really what we're getting at here. But he that receives gifts overthrows it. So something given. This is the problem with our money, that we can so easily dissociate money, or we can so easily dissociate, rather, certain types of value from absolute value. That is, it is almost a fragmentation of our experience. That we can exchange value, but also withhold the truth. But there's a way in which that's not necessary to articulate, because in the case of a bribe, it can be well known to both parties of the mischief that's taken place. In fact, it might not even seem to be mischief, I suppose. But maybe not. Maybe a bribe just implies there is this mischief that takes place. That there is a sense of things, a way of things, and that the bribe is contrary to that. Without that way of things, then it is just influence. It is just a marketplace of influence. But going back to this money idea, that since money is so heavily tied to material things, and that there are some things that money just cannot buy, as the expression goes, like love, this is something that requires a certain type of participation on behalf of the subject. That all the money in the world, all the accumulated material, just will not be able to satisfy. Now, that's not to say that material is bad. I think much can be said about the goodness of prosperity and of material abundance. He that receives gifts overthrows it. I'll come back to this money idea in a moment. But I want to talk about this word overthrow. It's quite simple to imagine how a person might accept a bribe, and then his judgment, again, however righteous or immoral it happens to be, his judgment will be altered by the influence of the other that bribes him. But what I'm concerned about here is thinking a little bit more deeply about overthrowing. When we speak of the word over, we could think about something that is both above something but also past something. That there can be a period that is over, that it is finished. We could say that the expression over the moon, that there is a sense of aboveness and beyondness and going around. And throw, of course, when we think about having something, grasping something, and then willfully disposing of it, throwing it like a rock or a ball so that it leaves our immediate participation. We can no longer articulate with that thing, that object or that idea, that society, whatever. And so there's this sense of throwing something important to its end. Throwing it above the point at which it can be retrieved. Beyond the point that it can be retrieved. And what I find fascinating here is that what we are being prompted to consider is the king that is performing the action of overthrowing. It is not the person that is bribing the king that is overthrowing, although that action is significant in that process, but it is the king by what he gives, or what he sacrifices. Again, he's giving a part of his agency. He's sacrificing a part of his authority, his position. It's almost like I'm thinking about a particular example, a friend of mine, his brother's wife unfortunately decided to leave his brother, even though they had 2 kids together, and her reason for doing so was that she felt that she did not have enough time for herself. And it's that unrestricted selfishness, the sacrifice of something so meaningful for something so superficial, or something so idealistic, like the possibility of achieving something greater than the position that they originally held, like the position of being the king in full possession of his authority, or the position of being a mother in full possession of her family. Now, I cannot say that the impulse for such a thing, for such a desire for possibility and of achievement is not tantalizing. Of course it is. Possibility is what drives us. The possibility drives a person to become a king. Possibility drives a person to become a father or a mother. But much like liberation, in the sense that if man is to find himself or to desire himself liberated from something, that's not bad in and of itself. But what is bad is the improper relationship, the liberation of something that's fundamental that ought not to be liberated from, or the sacrifice of some position that one had previously committed to, that by their duty, the abandonment of that station would severely reduce their original path in life. A man that flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. What a bizarre verse. A man that flatters his neighbor. So let's explore this. Flattery. I was also thinking about this to a degree today. That I was told by somebody that I had... It was a compliment about the way I think about something. And I felt an immediate recoil, that I was afraid of potential conceit. Not that the compliment was not appreciated, but rather that I was afraid what my mind would do with the compliment, that I would let it get to my head, that it would fuel my ego, and it would occupy a large part of my mind for longer than I wished it would, and I would lose some valuable time being or looking after, looking for, maybe, for God, and hard to say exactly what I thought the ramifications of it were, but it had something to do with the possibility for conceit and the the lack of insight that would necessarily follow by falling into the selfish satisfaction. Flattery, I find, as the definition goes, I think is an insincere form of complimenting. It is often stated for some alternative motion, that on the part of the flatterer, they do such things, they give such compliments, so that they can gain something, gain favor. And there's something fundamental in that, in the aspect of that flattery, that causes what appears to be negative, that net to be cast on our feet, symbolically restricting our movement. We'll get into that. But within the definition of flattery, we find the word insincere, a word meaning not expressing genuine feelings. When I think of the word genuine, I think of the word real. I think of the word true. Certainly it is possible that we may mistake ourselves, the way that we feel. In fact, I'm looking back now in chapter 28 of the Proverbs, verse 26. He that trusts in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walks wisely, he shall be delivered. And it's not that the heart is not ever truthful. Of course it is. But the capacity for the heart to release a feeling that is so deceptive to what is good, I think is confusing, certainly for me as a person that experiences things. And a matter of coming to understand something and to feel as I ought to feel appropriately given a certain situation is a matter of maturity. And it takes time and it takes practice, I think, to orient oneself in such a way. The insincerity of genuine feelings. In this case, we have a situation in which the person is quite aware of what they desire and what they wish. But with regard to the interaction, the individual wishes to blind the eyes of their neighbor, to hide their true intention. Because if the intention was known, then it would be likely the case that the neighbor would not necessarily associate or participate with us, let's say, if we are to imagine ourselves being the perpetrator. So the question is then necessarily, well, how does this play out if this is going to be a truth? Certainly it can be said that flattery can work, unfortunately, that somebody can be deceived by another, by their false appearances. And by those false appearances they may gain quite substantially. I think of the case now of fraud and abuse within our government that is being exposed by the Trump administration. I think about performative behavior that I may have engaged in, or I may engage in at times because I am uncertain how I should actually feel. And the only thing that matters in that moment is that I perhaps flatter a person, I may be laughing at their jokes or displaying some sort of feeling such that they think that I actually feel a particular way. But in fact, on the inside, I don't feel any particular way at all. but it is my desire that they like me or accept me, that it is enough for me to behave in such a way. It's not genuine. It's false. So again, I come back to the question, what is the necessary consequence of this false behavior? The second half of this verse, a man that flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. So we have the consequence here. Spreading a net for his feet. As I've mentioned, there is this image of binding the feet. A net is meant to capture. To capture the feet is a symbol of movement. It is something that carries us. Without movement, there is no participation with the world, with the environment, with others. Without this, we are severely diminished. We cannot provide for ourselves. There's something about this truthfulness of behavior, or true or genuine expression, that is the crux of this verse. Now, if I'm going to define genuine, the word authentic comes to mind. The definition from a simple Google search is truly what something is said to be: authentic, real, actual. Of a person, emotion, or action, sincere. The definition of sincere: free from pretense or deceit, proceeding from genuine feelings. The definition of authentic: of undisputed origin. So on the nature of dispute, then, I find it interesting that a disagreement between the inside and the outside, the presenting face, and the generative creation element, the dispute here is something that can cause us, the acting agent that is deciding to do this, to be tied, to be restricted. And I think this has to do with information, the type of information. If we are sending signals and what goes through that processing apparatus of the mind into the environment, not that it's two separate things, but as it is the same thing. The dispute and the recognition, or the failure of recognition, whatever, on the part of the other agent, is certainly, it can be said of this, an inaccurate data stream. Inaccurate data streams lead to error. Error leads to corruption. Corruption leads to failure of processing information. Failure of processing information leads to absence of function. Absence of function leads to, I think, absence of being at the end of it. And so what we are describing here is an evil act. Anything that tends towards absence is evil. A man that flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. By an evil action he restricts himself. In the transgression of an evil man there is a snare, but the righteous does sing and rejoice. So beginning with the first half of this verse. In the transgression of an evil man there is a snare. So what is this transgression of the evil man? So transgression, the suffix of this word means to move or to step. Trans, of course, means across. So when we think about moving across, stepping across something, I imagine a line or some boundary. It's a rule that is being broken. There have been plenty of episodes, plenty of days that I've gone into, speaking of transgression, trying to imagine a landscape for which it would be most productive to think about the term and to think about it in the context of any particular verse. For whatever reason, this might not be all that useful, but just imagistically, I think it sets the mood, it sets the tone. I find myself thinking about a desert. I think about an expanse that is beyond some definite boundary out in this desert. Before this boundary, on the just side of things, what we find is light, what we find is certainty, a way, a path forward. The boundary that I see is something deceptive. It almost looks like it's continuous with the landscape that we are coming from. But in fact, there's a steep cliff at the edge of that boundary. And for those who are not paying attention, they will cross it and go right over it. And of course, if they go over it, they will not be able to come back up to the other side with any ease. And I think it must be this way because evil, as has been said many times, is something that tends towards absence. It is something that I think damages the mind once that decision is made to participate in it or with it. Now, the image that's being invoked here is not something so dissimilar. In the transgression of an evil man, there is a snare. The snare in the case that I've presented is this trap beyond the boundary, that unavoidable fall to some place for which the person would be trapped, as they would in a snare, unable to get out of it. Now, if I think for a moment about my transgressions, however small or however large, I think even the smallest of transgression can be brought to a similar place intellectually when we think about the consequences. Not all transgressions, though, I think hold the same sort of punishment or effect. But ultimately, that mechanism surely remains the same. And as I also consider the path that I have been on over the past number of years, coming to faith and developing faith, I found myself thinking about myself in a critical way, but also approaching it with grace. in the sense that understanding about how one can transgress, how one can misstep and go wrong is not abundantly clear, I would say, in many cases. In some it is, and I think those of us who are blessed with good parents are able to see this easier, and those who are not surely must struggle in life. Their road, their faithful journey must, although quite fruitful, I would imagine, be fraught with low-hanging fruit of lessons that one ought to have learned earlier, but nonetheless. I think about a sin or the act of transgressing in the context of the participation that has gone on for a long time. And there's something about time, repetition with something that causes it to become second nature, almost. In the case of a transgression, if one is meant to feel shame or meant to feel something adverse in general to a negative breach of some law or rule, the breach is not associated with the appropriate feelings. The word normalized is used often in our culture today. And my biggest fear is having a transgression be normalized in my mind, either because I cannot or have not identified it, or because I'm too weak to prevent against it. And among my various dealings with things, there are not too many things that I know that I absolutely must avoid in order to avoid a transgression. Usually, I can navigate that wooded environment with ease. However, there are a few items in my life for which I know that complete abstinence is necessary, because for whatever reason, I have an inclination towards something that is destructive, that leads towards that path of evil, towards absence, destruction. In the transgression of an evil man, there is a snare. The object of this snare is something that I don't think can be understated, given what I've said about this propensity for a certain type of transgression, let's say. Now, this transgression I find interesting. Now, this is again reflecting on my own experience, because I think it comes from a quite simple place. It is for the desire for the mind not to be plagued by its own experience, strangely enough. And what I mean by that is there's a certain uncomfortability, I think, at least in my experience, about being, especially when the mind is not firing on all cylinders, and yet the will and the desire to be in some sort of, maybe not comfortable, comfort has something to do with it, but also productive state. The productive state and the comfortable state, they join hands, but they don't join hands immediately. There is required a period of warming up, let's say, of the mind, especially in the morning, when the mind is less than at its optimal state. Waking up out of this slumber, a stupor, I find to be an arduous, tedious process. And it is at these moments, but not exclusively to this, because I think in moments of fatigue, for which I just have difficulty focusing on things, the danger will also present there. The snare is there because it is a form of temptation, almost like the rat or the cheese that is on the mouse trap, for which the mouse or the rat is attracted to, but unaware of the consequences of taking it. And it is that release, whatever we might say that it is, the release of that uncomfortable awareness. The uncomfortable awareness, I think, is a good way to put it. It is almost as if the natural state of the mind and the environment with so much information produces this unbearable static through which, if it is not attentive, that static is just penetrating, almost like a knife. And it makes existence almost unbearable. It is noisy, wild, agitating. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the snare, of course. The snare, as I've mentioned, is the thing that tempts us towards a certain type of attention. But it's the attention of evil. It is the attention of nothingness. It is being able to release oneself in unproductive manners or ways. The coming through the static, the narrowing of attention. Some days is certainly easier than others, but there are certain days for which I wonder at the experience. I wonder at life. The irony is that we are inundated with so much information that it's almost as if information is simultaneously needed to appease the mind, but also it is one of the various things, one of the many things that contribute to the overstimulation and inundation of this white noise. I can't find a number for the amount of times that I have listened to a podcast or a speech, and I find myself sitting there listening, but not retaining, not understanding, not paying attention. And in that situation, it is the thing that I say that I unfortunately commit too often, is that it is that transgression, that outlet of inattentiveness. Now, I don't necessarily think that rest is a bad thing. I think there are times that the mind needs a period of offloading. But it's a matter of how it is offloaded. Because in that matter defines how we relate to goodness or otherwise, or relate to evil, towards absence. And if we take the unfortunate path, then it is not something that just ends when we snap out of the haze. It is something that continues with us. It is a damage. It is a breach in our constitution, almost like a breach in the skin. Now, thankfully, the skin does heal in time, but repetitive injury and insult maintains the wound, and it in fact makes it worse over time, increases the probability for it becoming infected, having a compounding, unfortunate situation. In the transgression of an evil man, there is a snare. But the righteous do sing and rejoice. Now it's funny, when I was thinking about that last bit, I thought about the productive ways in which this, the escape from the static into the wicked or the evil landscape can be prevented. I thought about the guitar. I thought about making music. It is something bizarrely passive, certainly active in certain respects, in terms of identifying patterns and memorizing patterns. Numbers, I think, is not a stretch here. It's certainly involved in musical theory. But engaging in music is a productive process. It is a process of focusing attention, but it is also a way of soothing the mind through the static. It gives us a productive information flow, but it also gives us the ability to perceive when we hit a point of dissonance, but we have the opportunity to correct it and to bring it into greater harmony. Now, I can't claim to be a good guitar player. In fact, I'm quite elementary, but I was practicing earlier today, and I was going through some scales, and I've been working my way through the minor scales, just repeating them through every note. It's all the same pattern, but what I found interesting when I was getting overwhelmed with the number of notes that were there and all the different patterns that exist, walking up to a root or down to a root note, the amount of patterns is mind-numbing. And it's very unlikely, I think, that memorizing all of the patterns is the most productive way, or not even the most productive way, but probably is not even, maybe it is possible, but for me, it seems that it is not possible. Now, that's not to say that I don't do these scales. I think it's good to practice, and I've been thinking lately that I should do these scales to practice, to warm up the fingers, to warm up the hand, the picking hand, and also the fretting fingers. But after this period, there's a point of diminishing returns, because I'm not necessarily understanding anything about the process of having a root note, moving up and then moving down to it, other than, of course, my auditory perception of it. And there is some development of that when I inadvertently go into a note that's outside of the scale. I can hear it and I must correct it, but I'm also easily lost. I must look at a tablature to see exactly what the next pattern in that scale is. But there's a way of exploring, I think, the guitar that necessarily utilizes the scale as your foundational infrastructure, the road, let's say. Now, this road is something that is established. Somebody else has laid it down for you to walk upon. That's not to say that you can't lay down a new road and a new path, but this one is established. It leads us to and from a root note reliably, and so we ought to take it. And once we get comfortable with the basic major and minor, then we can start to explore. We can find dissonance, we can find mistakes, and we can correct it. We can find different ways in which we can go to and from different root notes on different strings. In this process of exploration, although it does involve a bit of attention, it is at least for me, it is a type of attention that is tolerable given the noise and the static. It is a tolerable experience of coming to be. of warming up the mind, but also having this somatic integration. Exercise is something quite similar, though that is and can be quite stressful mentally. Now, I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll continue next time with verse 7 in chapter 29 of the Proverbs.